Well, thanks very much, Fran, and good evening, comrades and friends. I hope you're all safe and well. And we are approaching three very significant anniversaries, all of which would be worthy of detailed discussion, if not a whole meeting in themselves. It's 40 years ago, on the 10th of April, 1981, that an uprising erupted just down the road from where I live, here in Brixton, South London, an uprising which lasted for 3 days. 3 months later, in July of that year, there were similar explosions in Handsworth, Birmingham, in Southall in West London, in Toxteth in Liverpool, in Hyson Green in Nottingham, and of course also in Moss Side in Manchester, where you all are. And similar events took place in such areas as Leeds, Bristol and Edinburgh. It was a summer of unrest, captured as it happens by the #1 single of that summer, by the group called the Specials, Ghost Town. They're sometimes described as race riots, but that would be wrong, because although the uprisings had disproportionate numbers of young black people involved in them, it wasn't exclusively the case. Secondly, next month, April, also marks the anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. That was 28 years ago now, on the 23rd of April 1993. And finally, this year also marks the 10th anniversary of riots that erupted across England in August 2011 after the death of Mark Duggan at the hands of the police. I have a particularly vivid recollection of those events, not least because then, as now, I lived in an area that was very much affected by the events, but also as a practicing criminal barrister, I represented a number of the people who were arrested and charged in relation to those events. Now, all of those events are worthy of consideration, I think, particularly in light of the report by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, which was published this afternoon. I've not had the opportunity to read it. It runs to 258 pages, but the headline that has been trailed in the news all day is its conclusion that the UK is, and I quote, "not deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities." In short, it argues that whilst there continues to be overt racism, the kind of abuse you see footballers getting on Twitter and that kind of thing, that institutional racism, it no longer exists. And in fact, it argues that the United Kingdom is a beacon for the rest of the world. Now, I happen to know Tony Sewell, the author of the report. He has form, it should be said, dating back well over 20 years. So I wasn't at all surprised by his conclusions. And indeed, I think that Stand Up to Racism has got it spot on when it says that the report was always going to be a whitewash. Both Sewell and Boris Johnson's chief advisor, Munira Mirza, who was one of the key figures responsible for commissioning the report, have long since denied the existence of institutional racism. And the report was commissioned explicitly to, I quote, change the narrative. But changing narratives, even abandoning things like the use of the term BAME and BAME, doesn't change the reality of people's lives. It's a highly controversial report, especially when you set it against those events that I've mentioned. A previous study, the Scarman report, was written in response to the riots I mentioned at the beginning in 1981. That was the first major report that considered the question and the concept of institutional racism. It actually denied its existence, arguing that instead what existed, what the cause of the problem between black communities and the police at that time was a few rotten apples in the otherwise sweet and wholesome police barrel. It was the report commissioned into the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1988 that reported in 1999 that did finally acknowledge the existence of institutional racism, but it did so with, I would argue, a relatively weak definition, which attempted to provide a get-out clause for the police and other institutions. But nevertheless, it existed until the protests that we saw last summer, the extraordinary Black Lives Matter protests ago. The riots that erupted 10 years ago were arguably the most spectacular demonstration of the continued existence of structural racism. Now, I'm going to come back to those specific events, but I want to consider issues, if you like, closer to us in time, because the nature and role of the police has been catapulted to the top of the political agenda by the events that we've witnessed over the past few weeks. It was kickstarted, this debate, if you like, by the gruesome and tragic events surrounding the abduction of Sarah Everard. It was followed coincidentally by the row that erupted as a result of the new police bill that has been introduced by the government. And the issues raised, however, are not confined to Britain. This week has also seen, of course, the start of the murder trial of the police officer who killed George Floyd in Minneapolis in last May. So let me say something, if I may, about the Sarah Everard case. And of course, we begin, of course, with our hearts going out to and expressing condolences with her family and friends. I happen to live very close to Clapham Common, and therefore I witnessed the events as they unfolded that week. The desperate calls for further information, the posters on lamp posts, one of the searches that was taking place on Clapham Common as I went for one of my daily walks. And indeed, I went to the vigil on the Saturday evening after Sarah Everard's murder had been announced, the vigil that was so controversially halted by the police. And again, let me pause there for a minute, because one of the other things that you may have noted over the past couple of days is that the police watchdog, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, has published the report of their inquiry, which concluded, again, and I quote, that the police had acted appropriately in its handling of the vigil. That's not what many of us who witnessed it firsthand thought. And first of all, I'd argue it was breathtakingly insensitive and stupid of the Met Police to oppose the vigil in the first place, especially given that the suspect arrested and charged turns out to have been a serving police officer. Given those circumstances, they could have sought to cooperate with the organisers, reclaim these streets, and help to ensure that the event was safe and socially distanced. And ensuring that would have been easy enough, because Clapham Common is precisely that, a large expanse of open public land. But instead of cooperating, the police chose to go to the High Court on the Friday before and oppose it. And it's worth noting that many people had gathered that day to pay their respects, including, of course, Kate Middleton, and the likes of the Daily Mail and the Express were happy to print pictures of her. And I note again today that Metropolitan Police Commissioner Cressida Dick has helpfully told us that the princess didn't break any laws, because, of course, although it was not an essential trip for her to go to the Common, she did nevertheless maintain a 2-metre distance from other people. Contrast that with the event that took place later that same day, one that couldn't be tolerated and had to be shut down in the manner that we've all witnessed. I think what it does is it highlights in a very dramatic way the fact that there is one law for the rich and powerful and another law for everybody else. And let me give you another recent example, which I'm sure will strike a chord with you there in Manchester. We're approaching Easter. Cast your minds back to last Easter, which unhappily fell just after the start of the first lockdown. And that was when Boris Johnson's then chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, made his infamous trip to Barnard Castle in County Durham, despite his main home being in London. He's one of the people who was responsible for introducing the regulations of the lockdown, so he should have known full well what they were. Durham Constabulary announced that they believed he'd committed an offence. Nazir Afzal, a former chief prosecutor for the North West, sent a 200-page dossier to the police stating why he had committed an offence, and yet their conclusion was they would take no further action. Compare that with what happened a few weeks ago to Karen Reisman in Manchester when she organised that protest in St Peter's Square against the derisory 1% payoff for NHS staff. I used to live in Manchester. That's why I regard myself as an honorary Mancunian, a spiritual Mancunian, if you like. I happen to know Karen and have known her for decades and know how responsible she is. I also know how big St Peter's Square is. So there was no problem with the social distancing that took place on that demonstration, just as there needn't have been on Clapham Common. And yet Karen was hit with a £10,000 fine. So in a broad sense, if what I'm saying is true, it raises a really fundamental question about how society operates. We're constantly told, aren't we, that no one's above the law, that the laws are there to govern, protect and regulate the behaviour of all of us, and that we live under the same rules. Well, our argument as Marxists is that this really is absolute nonsense. The laws we live under are invariably made by the rich and powerful in order to protect and preserve their wealth and privilege, and they are enforced by institutions like the police and courts that act in their interests. And that really brings me back to the key question we're considering tonight, the fundamental nature and role of the police, because they are, I would argue, at the front line of maintaining law and order, the most obvious and visible manifestation of the state that we see on our streets. And in order to do so, they have to present some sense of their legitimacy and importance. So we're presented with, I would argue, the rather quaint notion that their presence is in order to keep us all safe and to solve crime. And that's reinforced by the drama series you see on TV or some documentaries, whenever they do manage to brilliantly and painstakingly solve a real life crime. The reality is that the police solve very little crime. One of the most recent studies, published in July last year, reported that in England and Wales, just 7% of offences saw someone summoned or charged. And that was down from 9% in the previous study. Now, I don't want to get too technical with you, but someone being summoned and charged does not automatically mean that they will be convicted. And of course, some people will end up being either convicted of or pleading to offences that they've not committed. But okay, let me be generous to the police and concede that they solve 7%. It's pitifully low. Imagine if in your exams at school or university, or in your appraisal at work, you registered 7%. How well do you think you would be considered to have done? And as an aside, you know, a significant proportion of those offences and convictions are for drug-related offences. Now, personally speaking, I have very real concerns about the effect that recreational drugs have, but that's another argument, that's another meeting. What I do believe fundamentally is that the laws that we have are hypocritical and should be scrapped. The key point I'm making is here, the primary role of the police is not to solve crime, and indeed it never has been for the entire time that they've been in existence. They were set up here in England and Wales originally at a time in the 19th century, at a time of social unrest. And the key power that was invested in constables was intended to enable them to harass and bully people who were out on the streets between certain hours and unable to account for themselves. It sounds a hell of a lot like the stop and search laws that we have today, doesn't it? And the first national police, that was the Metropolitan Police, the London-based police in the 1820s. The first national police service was set up in the 1830s in Ireland, and it was set up, not surprisingly, to quell Irish resistance, and was commended. It was made the Royal Irish Constabulary in the 1860s because of its repression of the Fenian uprising. So of course, the statutes, the rules, the regulations that we have, they don't explicitly say that that's what the police's role is, but they present the notion that we are policed by consent, with the trust and approval of the ordinary public. And I'd say, not surprisingly, most people, most of the time, probably accept this to a greater or lesser degree. Now, they might no longer believe in the, if you like, the homely image of the 1950s TV series Dixon of Dock Green, the idea, a kindly uncle type neighborhood police officer you could invite in for a cup of tea, who's able to sort everyone's problems out in a nice, gentle manner. I mean, TV dramas tend to be a bit more gritty these days, but what they do seek to do is present the idea that the police play this fundamentally important role in society, that they do at least keep us safe, and they do to some extent solve crime. And I think most people, most of the time, accept that characterization. But at other times, and for other people, their lived experience is in very sharp contrast. And you'll have noted the caveat that I've added there: most people, most of the time, because for significant sections of the population, that has either never been the case, or it's been shattered by their experience of policing. Black communities historically have always been over-policed and underprotected. That's why Darcus Howe, the great Trinidadian activist, wrote his book From Bobby to Babylon, which I would encourage you to read. It's been reprinted by Bookmarks last year, and it charts the way in which perceptions amongst the Black community since the Windrush generation changed from the idea of Bobby, the kindly Dixon of Dock Green-like police officer, to Babylon, the characterization of this oppressive outside force. It charts that developing belief as the experience of harassment, bullying, stop and search, people being overcharged, fitted up for crimes they hadn't committed, as that became an increasingly prominent feature of people's lives, and indeed was the cause of the 1981 riots I mentioned earlier. It's one of the central chapters in that book talks about the 1981 riots. And that oppressive experience is why those riots happened. It's why the 2011 riots that I mentioned happened. It's why so many people erupted onto the streets last summer. And yes, of course, here in Britain, we marched in solidarity with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other victims in the United States. But we also march with the names of victims of injustice on these shores of our lips. David Oluwale, who died at the hands of police officers in Leeds back in 1968. And since then, we can add the names we chanted on the streets last summer: Cynthia Jarrett, Cherry Gross, Christopher Older, Sean Rigg, Mark Duggan, the spark for those riots, Smiley Culture, and hundreds of others. The same injustice is witnessed around the world, and I would argue is why the problem that we talk about is not simply about this officer or that force or even this particular or that particular country. The problem lies in the nature of the society we live in and the role that the police play. And it's a historical problem. That's why it was one of the main focuses of attention of the great Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement in the United States in the 1960s. So those of us from Black communities may be the most frequent victims of this oppressive behavior, but we don't experience it exclusively. There are times when other groups are subjected to it, particularly workers when engaged in mass action. And I think that realization amongst mass numbers in why there is a growing debate about the concept of defunding the police, something people might want to pick up on the discussion. And that, Fran, really brings me on to the last thing I want to talk about in this introduction, which is the proposed new policing bill. it's an appalling piece of legislation, and amongst its worst proposals are those which are aimed at limiting the right to protest. Now, I'll come back to that specifically, but before I do that, it's worth noting that the last major piece of law of this type was the Public Order Act of 1986, and that law was specifically introduced in order to outlaw and limit the kind of mass protests that occurred during the heroic year-long miners' strike that dominated the political agenda in 1984-85. In other words, what happened then was that, having starved and beaten at the hands of the police the miners back to work, the then Tory government took further revenge on them and their supporters and working class communities generally by imposing further restrictions on our hard-won rights of assembly and protest. The proposed new police crime and sentencing and courts bill is in similar vein and is a direct response to the two great uprisings that we've witnessed in the past 2 years, namely Extinction Rebellion in the spring and autumn of 2019 and the Black Lives Matter explosions in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder last May. And the provisions are directly in response to that. You don't need to just take my word from it. The policy documents that accompany the bill directly quote Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, stating that ever since the Extinction Rebellion protests, she has lobbied the government and Parliament for a change in those laws, specifically in order to deal with protests of that type. So that's directly a response to Extinction Rebellion. And similarly, therefore the idea is the extraordinary idea of giving not just the police, but the Home Secretary directly, without having to go to Parliament, the powers to determine what sort of protests take place and to limit how those demonstrations take place. That's that's one aspect. The other aspect that you may well have heard of is the proposal to increase the penalties that can be imposed on people who desecrate war memorials and statues and so on. That proposal was introduced as a result of a debate in June last summer that took place immediately after, indeed in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests. So again, directly in response to that. And it is extraordinary that the increase in these penalties mean that in theory, I say, in theory, you could get much more for desecrating so-called a memorial than you could get for serious sexual offences. So let me begin to wind up, Fran, by saying this. The proposals are an outrage, but in some ways, think about it, they are a backhanded compliment to the power of protest. And so I think a question for discussion is what to do about that piece of legislation in the immediate future, and certainly looking forward to the COP26 talks, because I think there's little doubt that the proposals are intended in part to prevent mass protests when those talks come to Glasgow in the autumn. Let me finish, Fran, with a couple of quotes for posts actually that you may have seen on the SWP's social media presence, and with an observation. On the subject of the police, one of my great heroes, you can see her behind me here, Angela Davis, said this: "The announced function of the police to protect and serve the people becomes the grotesque caricature of protecting and preserving the interests of our oppressors and serving us nothing but injustice. What happened to George Floyd highlights this, and it is an outrage that the Minneapolis police are trying to put him on trial, which is what we're seeing just as that has started. And the realization of that, I think, is one of the reasons why we saw those great uprisings last summer. Secondly, Martin Luther King described riots as the voice of the unheard. And that's true, I think, in a number of respects. And it means that these kind of uprisings happen really quite spontaneously. And when, in an immediate sense, the decades long, the constant harassment and bullying is triggered by a spark into an uprising. And although you can't specifically predict when they happen, I can distinctly remember in that summer of 2011, at our Socialist Workers' Party Marxism Festival, people talked then about an atmosphere that could easily explode into anger. They could sense it because of their involvement with people on the ground in communities. A month later, those riots happened. But as we know, and certainly I witnessed this, seeing what happened to the people I represented in the courts, we know that in their aftermath, the state took revenge. It imposed exemplary sentences on people. We want, and I'll finish with this, Fran, to ensure that our side wins lasting victories. And I think that's why meetings like this, it's important for us to consider the best ways in which we can organise resistance and struggle that can lead our side to an ultimate victory. Okay, thanks, Fran.
Thank you very, very much, Brian. That was really interesting.